Did anybody experience life after death? My grandfather was on his deathbed and all his life considered himself an atheist. I wasn't convinced of that because I heard him many times talking about religion, and I know that somewhere in a corner of his heart he believed in God. A week before dying, he started hearing a beautiful music, a chorus that sounded divine. He asked me a couple of times if I could hear it myself, and because I didn't want him to think he was crazy, I confirmed. He also started seeing a person that he said was sitting by his bed and waiting for him without saying a word. He asked me several times if I see the person and to remove it from the room because it scared him. I figured that he was hallucinating, and I agreed with everything he was saying. 2 days before he died, my grandfather had a moment of lucidity. He was a very intelligent person, and we usually had this deep conversations that never got me bored. That day we talked about soul, God, death and afterlife. He asked me questions and wanted to know my opinion on those topics, especially on afterlife. As my opinions were subjective, based on what I have read or my own experience, he proposed to make a pact. Who dies first amongst us two comes to the other in a dream and shows them if there is life after death. I shook his hand and he fell asleep with a smile of relief. 2 days later he was gone, and a couple of weeks after that I had a dream. I dreamt that I was walking on a country road and I could see flowers everywhere. The light was bright but didn't bother my eyes. It was very warm but without making me hot. I felt that the light was wrapped around me and very comforting. I continued to walk until I saw a small white house surrounded by lots of beautiful flowers. I knocked on the door and my grandfather opened it. He seemed to be very happy to see me and invited me in. Before I woke up from my dream, I heard his voice asking me to make a coffee. I told my grandmother about the dream as I couldn't understand what it meant. She started crying softly and told me that my grandfather always had this dream of buying a small white house somewhere in the country and plant lots of flowers. She also reminded me that my grandfather loved coffee, but for the last 30 years of his life he wasn't allowed to drink caffeine because of his high blood pressure. I understood then that he kept his promise and came to show me that life after death exists. Next experience, it made the first one even more credible. My grandmother died a year after my grandfather, and a while after her death I had the same dream, with the same small white house surrounded by beautiful flowers, and once again I knocked on the door. My grandmother opened the door this time and I could see my grandfather in the background sitting on a chair and reading a book. He raised his eyes, looked at me with a serene face and said, "Your grandmother is good now that she is with me in our new house." Now I'm going to narrate the third experience I had, but this one is not the last. I've had a couple more, but I will stop here because I don't want to bore anybody. I had a friend. She was 25 years old and died of stage 4 kidney failure. Before she died, she spent a month in the hospital and she seemed to be scared of dying the whole time. I tried to encourage her that she will be fine and soon she will come home and we could go have some fun and dance in a club. I made her promise me that after Christmas we would go together to dance. She promised. The night she died, it was a Saturday, I dreamt that I went to a house in a town I've never seen in my life. I knocked at the door and guess who answered? My grandfather. I checked the house and there were no walls, but instead were white sheets that were floating everywhere and were replacing the walls. I met my friend there. She was dressed in a gown like the ones they wear in the hospital. She grabbed me in a hug and started dancing with me and crying. I wanted to ask her why she was crying, but she did not answer and continued to dance with me. I woke up the next morning knowing that she was dead.